All right. Thank you, Mindy. Yeah, so we're back with week 2 of the Big Blue Book Club's presentation of Beautiful Boy. It's a lot of alliteration there. I was just thinking, I got my tea. I don't know if you all are tea drinkers, but it seems like peanut butter and jelly, book clubs and tea. They just go well together. This is like a minty spearmint
Sounds like
tea.
a plan.
Yeah, it fits well. Reminder that we're reading the book in 3 parts. So for this week, you should have read up through parts 3 and 4. If you haven't, again, no points will be taken away. No harm, no foul. Just means you've got plenty of intriguing reading ahead of you to read the remainder of the book for our discussion next week on July 26th. So we're going to jump in with something that's kind of a one-off. This doesn't really fit the narrative of the meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about today, but I didn't know where else to include it. So I just kind of threw it at the beginning. And that is, I mentioned in our last session that if I were being critical of David, and I hesitate to be critical of him in this situation, but he did a lot of time researching methamphetamine, the drug itself, and he spent far less time dedicating to trying to understand addiction. And I think trying to understand the nature of addiction might have been far more helpful and more meaningful to his family. And so in early in part 3, he writes quite a bit about the research on meth, and he kind of characterizes it as a super drug. And I take issue with that only because it's a pattern, it's a narrative we've seen play out time and again. We saw the same thing with crack cocaine in the 1980s. It was characterized as a super drug. In some ways, the same thing is happening with fentanyl today. And the reality is these are certainly harmful drugs, but it may surprise you to find that we actually prescribe drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl every single day in hospitals across the United States. Methamphetamine to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or for weight loss, prescribing fentanyl for acute pain or for palliative care. So it's a little dangerous to just sensationalize drugs and talk about them as if they're super drugs. In reality, what we want to focus on is addiction itself. So I've called part 3 purgatory, and that's my word, not David's, but I call it that because I think a lot of parents can identify with the experience of being in that liminal space between, are they better, are they worse? Do I even know? 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. I think a lot of family members can identify with spending a lot of time in that place. And so on one of the rides to treatment, David finally convinces Nick to go to treatment a number of times. And on one of those rides, David remarks that Nick is changing right before his eyes. And he says Nick is supercilious and condescending, almost savage. And it reminded me of an experience I had early in my addiction when I sat down with a family counselor with my parents. And I became angry and defensive about something. And the counselor turned to my parents and said, Alex has left the room and his addiction has taken over. And in the moment, it made me very angry and even more defensive. But largely, I think he was right. I mean, that's the nature of an addiction that hijacks the brain, as we like to say. And so David asked, who are you? If it weren't for some very identifiable features of his son, he wouldn't recognize the person in front of him as his son by his behavior. And then interesting, later on in chapter 17, much later in the book, David, it's a period of time when Nick is doing better in his recovery. And David writes on the phone, he sounds like the old Nick in his right mind. And it reminded me of my mom talking about her desperation just to have opportunities to talk to me on the phone, because she really thought she could use it as a barometer to assess whether or not I was safe or healthy or doing well. And it's probably not all that reliable as a measure, but we can all probably empathize with parents just being desperate to know that their children are okay. So since Nick is changing before David's eyes, I thought we would explain why it is that Nick changes and more broadly, why it is that people change when they become addicted. And sometimes I think I do too much talking about the brain in just all of my presentations on addiction. And then other times I think we do not nearly enough, because at its core, what addiction is a brain disorder. So I'm not going to dedicate more than 5 minutes to this because I don't want to get carried away. But for the benefit of everyone in the book club, I thought it might be helpful just to briefly discuss what's happening when people get addicted to drugs. So what drugs do, chronic exposure to drugs, day in, day out, week after month, causes long-term changes to the brain. And the main change, there are many, but the main change that we see in the brain is to a neurochemical in our brain called dopamine. And you may have heard of dopamine before. It's really our pleasure chemical. And so what drugs do is they cause a short-term spike in dopamine. That's what gives you the short-term pleasure, the payoff of drugs. But over the long term, they cause a process called downregulation, which basically means your dopamine receptors are drying up. And if you use drugs long enough in addiction, severe addiction leads you to a place called anhedonia. And it's a really cool word. So if you break down the parts of this word, an means not, and hedonia means pleasure. So it means no pleasure. And it's referring to a brain that's in exactly that addicted state, that's lost so much of its dopamine over time that it can't derive pleasure naturally from the world around it. So the things that you or I might do to take a break during our day, maybe you go for a walk, maybe you take in a little sunshine, maybe you talk to a friend, all of those things would trigger the release of a little bit of dopamine, which would improve our well-being and our sense of connectedness with the world around us. And when people are severely addicted, they can't experience those things. And it's not because they choose not to, it's because their brains won't allow them to. And there's an interesting note that David includes from a psychiatrist, I think, who notes that some people can be so severely addicted that it's not that they're unwilling to participate in their treatment, it's more that they're unable to participate in their treatment. And I wanted to add some context to that. There's an interesting explanation, and that's because dopamine is not just our pleasure chemical, but it's also our motivation chemical. So take Parkinson's disease, for instance. What Parkinson's is, there's some similarity to addiction because it's also a dopamine problem. So where people don't have dopamine operating properly, who have Parkinson's, they may have the thought that they want to walk across the room, but they lack the dopamine necessary to motivate that behavior, to actually get up and walk across the room. And so if you apply that same kind of idea to addiction, you can imagine that there are people who are severely addicted who find it very difficult to participate in their own treatment. And oftentimes we use really negative terms when we talk about them, and we'll say either that they're frequent flyers because they relapse a lot, or they're non-compliant. And that's a little bit, depending on how you see it, I guess. I don't want to tell you how to view it, but depending on how you view that, that might be a little bit harsh, because it might be failing to recognize that with the brains that someone has who's addicted, they might not be able to do all of the things that we want them to do. So that's all dark and dreary. I always, when I talk about the brain, want to make sure I include a hopeful note, which is if what addiction is down regulation, losing dopamine in your brain, then really what recovery is upregulation of that chemical, is kind of returning it to its normal state. And fortunately for us, first of all, with periods of abstinence, the brain does that all by itself. It naturally regenerates dopamine. So on page 140, one of the therapists tells David, time off the drug is the best predictor of time off the drug. And so that might seem like a truism, but it is a fact. Research shows that abstinence begets more abstinence. The longer that a person has been in recovery, the more likely they are to maintain recovery. And so last little tidbit on the brain, I just can't resist but to show these PET scans. If you've had my presentations before, you know this. So if you want to get fancy, these are called positron emission tomographies. Basically what we're doing is we're looking at dopamine activity in people's brains. So the brain on the far left that says normal control, that's a normal person's brain. And you can see the red, that means there's plenty of dopamine activity in that brain. That's a normal, healthy, functioning brain. The brain in the middle looks very different. It doesn't have that red. It doesn't have nearly as much dopamine activity. And that's exactly what an addicted brain looks like. That's what anhedonia looks like. Well, you know, that you're so downregulated of dopamine that now you're just plumb miserable. There's just nothing in the world that'll make you feel good except for a drug. But here's what's really interesting about this particular PET scan. That brain in the middle is not actually an addicted brain. That's the brain of someone who was addicted to meth, and now they're 30 days abstinent. So you can imagine this is someone who just left a treatment center or 30 days in county jail. And a lot of times we like to think of them as having graduated treatment, well on their way. And the reality is they have an utterly addicted brain and they're utterly miserable. So oftentimes people will ask about why it is that people relapse and why a person would choose to go back to using drugs after they've had a period of abstinence and after it seems like they've gotten through the hardest part. And the simple answer is, it's a little bit oversimplified, but the simple answer is because they're miserable, because they have brains that won't allow them to enjoy the world around them. That's why recovery is the ultimate form of delayed gratification. You got to do all the work for months and months and months before you ever get to feel the real positives. So last note, the brain on the far right, that's the person who has been abstinent of methamphetamine for 2 years. And you notice that brain is almost completely healed. So the reality is people do heal and they recover fully to lead normal, very happy lives, but it takes time. And so the question that David is begging to ask is how do we get more time for Nick? And the question I want to ask you is, how should we understand addiction? So this is a very fundamental question when it comes to addiction and recovery. And before we send you into this breakout, I want to make very clear that there is no right answer. And I don't say that as a platitude. I say that because it's true. When you talk to the foremost addiction researchers and thinkers of the day today, there is not widespread consensus about what addiction is. So how do you see it? Is it a disease? Is it a choice? Is it a condition? Is it a syndrome? Is it a disorder? Is it a habit? Is it something else? I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. So spend 10 minutes in breakout and we'll see you on the other side. All right. Looks like we've just about got everybody back from breakout. So I'm assuming this is an issue about which just about everyone has a thought, not necessarily an opinion. That's a little bit harsh. That makes it sound negative, but I'm assuming we all have some sort of a concept of what we think addiction is. So I wonder if, and by the way, we did really good with this last week. There were a lot of people who jumped out and weren't afraid. So I wonder if we can get some more folks who just aren't afraid to share kind of what their understanding of addiction is.
I would like to speak if I can.
Please.
I shared that I believe addiction is a disease. Like in my situation, I'm predisposed to becoming an addict due to my family genetics. My father was an alcoholic. My grandmother, his mom, was an alcoholic. So genetically speaking, I was predisposed to becoming an alcoholic. But then I also shared that, in some ways, some people get upset when it is characterized as a disease, because like I shared, when someone is suffering from cancer, 99.9% of the time, they didn't do something to cause themselves to get cancer unless they deliberately expose themselves to radioactive stuff or something of that sort. Or, like in my mom's case, God rest her soul, she smoked for over 40 years and she died of lung cancer. So the chemicals in the cigarettes caused her to become addicted and then to die from cancer. So, yeah, I believe that addiction is a disorder. A disease. And especially with you talking about the dopamine, where the addict cannot get a natural feeling of pleasure. They have to only get it through a substance. So I thought that was very interesting. So that was my take on what I think an addiction is.
Well, thank you for jumping out and sharing that, Barbara. And I think you are in line with probably the majority of people today who understand addiction as a disease. As you mentioned, genetics, some of the brain scans, there's some pretty good evidence for that, but there's a legitimate reason why some other people take a different view. So I wonder if, I think Nancy had her hand raised. Nancy, did you want to share a little bit about what you were thinking? And maybe you did that by accident, and that's okay too.
No, I was just having a little trouble unmuting.
No worries.
Our group I think most of us kind of felt it was all of the above. It has aspects of, well, maybe not moral failing. That's a judgment on the part of the one who's characterizing it. But it is a choice in the sense that ultimately you can treat addiction forever. But if the person doesn't decide to go along with it, to say, okay, I'm going to try real hard not to do this anymore, because, as they say in the 12-step programs, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. So
Yep. Yeah.
So there is an aspect of choice too, but it's not all choice.
Yes. And that's very well said. And we could honestly spend the next 3 hours having this discussion in part because of what you just said, because there seem to be aspects of all of these. So it's tremendously complicated. And so the disease model does a pretty good job of giving us a slightly simplified understanding, but we understand disease. So we understand what that means. It also has the effect of destigmatizing addiction. And I'll tell you that my own journey with understanding addiction has gone through 7 or 8 different evolutions. And I have fallen somewhere kind of, I think, where Nancy's group fell, that there are aspects of all of these and that it's complicated. And if anybody wants more of an explanation of that, I'd love to sit down and talk with you about it, but we got to move on today because we got more to cover. So jumping back into parts 3 and 4 and thinking about addiction as a family disease or disorder or habit, however you like it. In classical family systems, in family science, where I got my master's and PhD, what we teach is families are systems like mobiles. And so my advisor would be really pleased to hear me mention Murray Bowen is kind of the father of family systems. And he argued that families are not just like any other group of people. They're not just a group of people. They're a group of people who are so intimately emotionally connected that what any one person does impacts the other. And so the quintessential way that we describe this in family systems is by using a mobile, like you might hang above a child's crib. Because as with a mobile, when you move any one piece, all of the other pieces have to move to sort of account for that energy, for that shift. And so certainly when drugs enter the equation, they cause the entire mobile to shift. All of the pieces have to sort of modify to address the issue. And so all of families are impacted. So family members need support. And I want to be careful how I say this. I've said family members can become afflicted, in quotations, with addiction too. I don't want to pathologize family members, but in some ways, family members can become sick with their loved one's addiction. Previously, David described it as being addicted to his child's addiction, but family members have physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual impacts. My own mom talked about losing weight, having changes in appetite and mood, just like you would with any physical condition. And so one of the things that David does that I salute him for is they got the family into family counseling. And as a family therapist, I'm such a proponent of this, very biased, but also a proponent, not just to get into counseling, but to get a family counselor who really looks at the family as a system. And to his surprise, the family counselor's advice was almost exclusively for David and his wife. And that's not a surprise to me, because as a family counselor, one of the advantages of family counseling that I know about is when you have someone in the family who's addicted, even when they're not willing to begin making any sort of changes, they're not in a place where they're ready for that, we can still begin working with the family to set boundaries that are healthy, to make sure they're taking care of themselves, to make sure they're keeping their marriage healthy, that the rest of the family is healthy, and that they're supporting their loved one the best that they can. And so David goes through this long period of what I've described as guarded optimism. He's afraid of his own hope, because every time he feels hopeful, Nick seems to relapse and it seems to devastate him again. And so there was one small moment where he's at Nick's graduation and he describes being completely nervous, and not nervous excited the way that the other parents are. He's just plumb nervous because he doesn't know what Nick's future is going to look like. And it made me really sad for David and for family members of addicted loved ones everywhere, of all the things that they're robbed of. One of my favorite artists, Macklemore, says dependency has been a thief at night. And I think family members can relate to that, all the things that dependency has taken from them. Another thing that I salute David for is that he goes and finds support from other family members who are having the same experience. So he goes to Al-Anon, which is a companion program to AA for family members. Family members actually work their own 12 steps. It's a great program. I wouldn't endorse that one alone. There are lots of support groups for families that are really helpful. But what David experiences that's so powerful that I want to point out is he suffers in silence for a long time because he's embarrassed and ashamed to talk about his son's addiction. But finally, as as Nancy just mentioned us a moment ago, David himself becomes sick and tired of being sick and tired. And he comes to a place where he says, I need support myself. And I'm willing to walk through the shame and discomfort of finding that kind of support. And he talks about how his judgment of the people in these spaces slowly turned to affinity. And I just wanted to comment on that because that was also my experience. When you walk into a lot of these support groups, you know, addiction's the great equalizer. So oftentimes you're walking into rooms where there are a lot of people who aren't like you. And it becomes really easy to judge people and to think that they have nothing to offer to you. And there's a guy named Ben. I'm choosing only to use his first name because he's a real person and I want to protect his anonymity. But there's a guy named Ben who experiences chronic homelessness. And he attended a lot of the first 12-step meetings that I went to. And I remember when I first started going to those meetings, I had a very harsh judgment of who he was as a person who slept on the street and surely had nothing to offer me. And 2-3 years later, it was clear to me that Ben was the wisest person in the room, that his life experiences, he had more to teach the rest of us about dealing with addiction than anyone. And that's what happens in those spaces. So just a powerful nod to people to go and get the support that they need. Also, this is a really small tidbit that I am pulling a lot out of. So maybe I'm doing too much here, but in chapter 16, somebody asks, I think David, maybe it's his wife, but I think they asked David, can you work the snack bar this weekend? I think for his children's swim team. And it reminded me of my mom talking about how one of the main things she wishes other people knew about the experience of having a family member who's addicted is that addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum. In other words, the world doesn't stop spinning so that families can address their loved one's addiction. Instead, the world keeps turning and the rest of the stress and real things that happen continue to happen. So in the case of my own family, my little sister was having academic trouble, and then her boyfriend died in a car accident, both of which was imposing a ton of stress on her and on the family. My mom's father was on his deathbed. And so that's why we call her generation the sandwich generation. When you're middle-aged and you're caring for parents who are aging, but also maybe caring for maturing adult children who, in the case of Nick, aren't prepared to take care of themselves and be independent. And it means you're getting pressure from both sides. And so David speaks to this a number of different ways. On page 186, he says, I'm present, talking about being with Jasper and Daisy, but I'm absent. And he says, Nick is still gone, but life does not stop. And then a little later on, I've read this book probably 5 times, and every time I read this book, this section just kind of gives me pause. He gives advice to parents, choose your music carefully. And he talks about some of the songs that have a really powerful emotional connection for him. And he talks about breaking down in the middle of a store, and I can identify with that. There's music that has a really powerful hold on me and my connection that can take me back to that place. So jumping into part 2, this is kind of a continuation of the first breakout, but also a little different. So in part 1, I wanted to know how you understand addiction. Now I want to know how you understand relapse. And this may be predicated on how you understand addiction, or it may not be. But what do you think about the idea of relapse? Are people choosing to use drugs, or should we hold them responsible for that? Is this a symptom of a disease? How do you understand that? Take 10 minutes and I'll meet you on the other side. All right, taking it down to the wire. That means intense discussions. That's good. So kind of piggybacking off of our first breakout. Does anybody want to jump out there? What are your thoughts on relapse?
Well, I think our group brought to the forefront also that most of the rehabs are too short, or when they do get out, they go right back to where they were. There's no support system. Yeah, they can go to meetings and stuff, but there's no true support system while their body is physically trying to mend itself from the effects of the addiction.
Right. Yeah, well said. I was not to pick on Johnson County, but I was in Johnson County not long ago, and I learned that when folks get released from their detention center, if they don't have a home to go to, there's nowhere to go. There's really nowhere to go. And so when you think about someone being addicted and simply saying, well, you just need to stay sober, it might be a little oversimplified because they need to stay sober and they got to find a way to rebuild their life through a mess of, maybe lacking resources, maybe not. So yeah, thank you for that. Did anybody else want to share? Oh, Nancy's got her hand raised. What were you thinking, Nancy?
I'm sorry, I have to hit the unmute about 3 times before it actually works. I just wanted to say that, I ran a 12-step program in, a little county jail for, I don't know, 1.5, 2 years, and for women.
Mhm.
And a woman was looking toward discharge, absolutely no support system. Maybe she was going back to Henderson or Bowling Green or Louisville. And the only people she knows are the people who are part of her addiction. She has no place to live. She has no job, and now she's got a felony on her record, which makes it much more difficult. And in order to stay sober, either she has to find a halfway house that's ready to take her right then, or go down on the corner and sell her body in order to get enough money to rent a place. And I'm not sure that clean and sober prostitution is a very great substitute for addiction.
Right.
Right. It's scary the way these people are not supported.
Yes, and that's why I think the word choice is more complicated. It seems like such a simple word, but you just did a good job of describing how limited people's choices become once they've become addicted, once they've entered the criminal legal system. So we might say just make the right choice, but making the right choice might be so much more difficult in one context rather than another. Let's take one more. I see Tamsin's got her hand raised.
Yes, in our community, we have like a rehab setting. It's like a long-term setting. We've had a group of men come out, and we had like a driveway put in, a concrete driveway put in some years back. We had some men from the facility come in, put the driveway in. Fantastic. We were able to have them in for lunch, and it was a good experience. That at that facility they do other things, carpentry, they have groups that go out and do things. And they have I guess it's a halfway house. I think that's what they're called. And we have now up on our main street, I live in a little small community, we have a radio station they're trying to start up. And across from the main street, that's the house they live in. And I mean, the community's accepting these people into the community, but yet they take them to the job site. They have things for them to,
Yes,
jobs to do of their skills and stuff. And I just think it's fantastic. I mean, you just don't hear that.
Yes. Yeah. And actually, in just a minute, I'm going to refer back to that comment about giving people opportunities for jobs. We're going to touch back base with that. So again, relapse is an issue we could spend a lot of time talking about, a lot of debate about what exactly it is. I think it's complicated. If nothing else, we can say that it's complicated. So Nick, we talked about David looking for support with the family. Nick also goes and finds some support. So he meets a writing professor in college who tells Nick that if he can remain sober, that this professor will work with him to really hone and develop his writing skills. And it reminded me to mention to you that Nick Sheff actually wrote his own memoir of addiction, and it's called Tweak. And it's a very good book, but I want to be very clear that there's an extra graphic warning for Nick's memoir, because as you might imagine, Nick is the one who experienced these things, so he has much more intimate detail of some of the things that he did, and it's very dark. But it's also very candid and honest, and if you're prepared for it, it's a good book. Nick also finds support from his sponsor in a 12-step program, Randy, and Randy becomes a really important person in his life. And so this is where I said I wanted to refer back to places like Isaiah House and Addiction Recovery Care, and these organizations who really understand it's not just about not using drugs. You've got an entire life that has to be rebuilt. And you got to improve somebody's quality of life so that it's worth it for them to be sober. Because if people are miserable when they're sober, they're not going to stay sober. Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone put in that work to be miserable, right? So I thought it was worth noting that there are people who took chances on Nick, despite the fact that his past had shown that he could relapse, that he might not be able to hold it together. People took chances on him, and it made a difference in his life. And the same is true for me. And I didn't want to pass the opportunity to say, I probably wouldn't be here doing what I get to do if it weren't for people taking chances on me. And I think that's an important way that the community plays a role. We say that addiction in 12-step programs, we say addiction is cunning, baffling, and powerful. Oftentimes, there's not a lot else that we can say about addiction other than that. So Nick goes to college and seems to do well for a while, and then he relapses again. And so David, again, is plagued with concerns over whether or not he's made the right decision. Did he cause Nick's relapse by sending him to college? Was it too much stress? These are all questions that my family asked of my own experience. And ultimately, David comes to a place where he says there's a desire to blame someone or something, but the only thing that's knowable is that Nick has a terrible disease. That's David's understanding of it. For you, it might be a terrible disorder, terrible habit, however you like it. I think the point here is that sometimes all we know is that it's awful. And then something really confounding happens. There's a period where Nick is home for the summer and it seems like he's been doing much better. And then in a fit of rage, he gets in a fight with David and he confesses that he's been using methamphetamine basically the entire time he's been home. And now David's not just angry and he's not just hurt, but he's angry with himself. And he's angry with himself for not knowing. And I thought this was worth mentioning because many family members have this experience. And frequently parents ask me about signs and symptoms of drug use. And there are some, and I can give them to you, but you should also know that people who are addicted often do a very good job of hiding it because we have to. It's sort of survival instinct, in a sense, protecting our ability to continue to use. And so oftentimes people function at quite a high level without giving off a lot of indications. And so David continues to suffer. And I didn't want this book club to pass reading this book without me dedicating a slide simply to the suffering of David, because this is a book written from his perspective as a family member. And my goodness, does he suffer? Does he ruminate over what's the right thing to do for his child? It's just really agonizing to read, I think, this section of the book. On page 195, he says, I shock myself with my ability to rationalize and tolerate things once unthinkable. And if you're a family member of an addicted loved one, you likely know exactly what this means. My family talk about how when I got arrested on drug trafficking charges at 18 years old, we thought that was the worst thing that could ever happen to our family. And we thought that was solid rock bottom. And it's almost laughable in retrospect, given some of the difficult things I went through in my addiction. Getting arrested was sort of child's play. And it's that ability to rationalize and tolerate things once unthinkable. Also, he writes, every time the telephone rings, my stomach constricts. And this is exactly what my mom would say. She would get telephone calls from area codes in Cincinnati or Nashville, places where I might be homeless. And she thought it was me. And she thought it might be a coroner or a police officer. And I included this because I want to mention that many family members exhibit symptoms of PTSD. And you can actually be diagnosed with PTSD secondhand by sort of secondhand experience of a traumatic event, a la a family member who's addicted. And whether or not family members actually reach the level of a clinical diagnosis of PTSD, the point here is they're deeply affected. That's called an exaggerated startle response. You're supposed to react when the telephone rings, but you're not supposed to experience dread. That's not normal. And on page 199, David writes, being robbed is a visceral, traumatizing experience anyway, but to have it be my son. And it's one of the most disturbing, I guess, cunning, baffling, and powerful parts of addiction that people have to steal to support their addictions. Most everyone I know who had a severe addiction did. And again, the best way that I know to frame this for you is in terms of survival. When you're hungry, you'll steal for bread. And if you're starving for a drug, you'll steal for a drug. And that's people doing what they have to do. And that's not a justification, just an explanation. You can't imagine what that's like as a family member. But I also didn't want us to forget that Nick himself is suffering. And sometimes I hear parents say, like in Al-Anon meetings, I heard parents say sometimes that parents suffer worse because at least the person who's addicted can get high for a little while. And that's really not fair. It's really just not an accurate representation. The truth is the person who's addicted, they're miserable like you can't understand. That's anhedonia. And there was a really interesting note where David calls Randy, Nick's sponsor, to reveal that Nick has relapsed. And Randy says to David, don't worry, Nick won't stay out long. He isn't having any fun. And he's really speaking from experience there as a person in recovery, because and we actually see this in the research also. People's time between relapse and returning to treatment tends to get shorter and shorter as time goes on, because they're quicker and quicker to get to a really miserable place. And it really has to do with the brain, because your brain downregulates dopamine faster and faster the longer that you use. But also addiction is a chronic disorder. That's the way that the scientists, most of the recovery scientists like to characterize it today. And so chronic disorder, you think of other chronic disorders like diabetes, hypertension, asthma. There's relapse or a recurrence of symptoms in all of those disorders. And so oftentimes people say relapse is a part of recovery. And part of the reason we say that is because it's the normative experience. The average person in recovery today got there by trying and failing, trying and failing, trying and failing, and then trying again. And so I wanted to ask a question of you. This is kind of a reflection back to that second breakout, but do you think that someone can be trying and failing at the same time? Because I'm just speaking personally here, from my vantage point, that was my experience. I went in and out of treatment centers, disappointing my family time and time again, wanting desperately to make it stop. Trying and failing at the exact same time. You know, it looked like I was choosing to use drugs, but man, when you've got a brain that won't let you choose what you want to choose, it doesn't feel like a choice. So we're going to jump into our third breakout here. I realize we're just a few minutes over time. Apologize for that. You got 10 minutes. So remember back to our first session. I asked you two of those questions. One was, how well do you think Nick's family addressed his drug use when it first became apparent that he was using marijuana? And we talked about that. And then I asked you how well you think that his family addressed his drug use when it became kind of chaotic, when it had graduated to methamphetamine and he disappeared for 4 days. And even now we've evolved to a different place where Nick is utterly addicted. He has clearly what we would diagnose as a severe substance use disorder. He's experiencing lots of harms associated with that addiction. And so it almost seems like it's a different stage. So I wanted to check in with you all again. How well do you think Nick's family has responded at this point? And what might you have done differently? All right, almost everybody back. Once again, another group taking it to the wire. I love that. It means you're really connecting over this conversation. So I want to be mindful of time. We're already 10 minutes over, but I don't want to dismiss us without hearing your thoughts on this, just since we've been riding with David through this evolution of Nick's addiction. So what did you all think of David's family's response to Nick's addiction at this point?
Hey, Alex.
Hey.
Hey, this is Glenda. Our group thought that they, did the best that they possibly could, seeking counsel and going to the rehab and trying to do the tough love and that sort of thing. Because we all feel, it's an emotional thing. It's not something that is in black and white, a right or wrong thing that you can do. The only thing that kind of stuck out to me is that when the mother paid the fine for the forged checks, there was, part of me that thought maybe she should have let him go to jail, but we don't really know her side of the story and what she's gone through to that point. Mm-hmm. But I think we all sympathize with the family. And when you get blindsided by that, you really don't know what is the right thing to do. But I remember the part in the story when he wanted to go do something, his wife said, "You're going to be disappointed," but she could see that he had to do something. Yes. It's your own peace of mind where you have to do something to know you at least tried.
Yes, I appreciate that you said that, Glenda. A lot of what you shared there, and that in particular, two things. So one, it's hard enough parenting when your kids are well-adjusted and healthy and you disagree about things, but parenting when your child's addicted and you disagree about the best path forward is a nightmare for a marriage. And it certainly was the case in my parents. In my own example, my parents disagreed in a lot of cases about how to go forward, and it creates a tremendous amount of tension. And my parents spoke to exactly the experience you just did, which is sometimes, even though we're hearing other people say this may not work or this didn't work for us, sometimes we have to find out for ourselves. And that might be especially be true when it comes to the love of a family member. So thank you for sharing that, Glinda. Does somebody else want to share what you thought about? Yeah, Tamsin.
Sometimes you have to be tough to be supportive. And that's kind of a hard way to look at it, but it kind of puts you on like a seesaw type of experience. You don't know sometimes if you're going to do too much or not enough, but you've got to look through the experience of the whole situation. I think each individual, I felt like, in my situation, maybe my husband's situation, we couldn't look at it as a whole concept, everything. It was each piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
As we went along. And we had to make that decision as a family to know what we were going to, be doing.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And it's why family members, in some respects, have to take addiction one day at a time, just like their addicted loved one. Nancy's got her hand raised. Let's hear from Nancy, and then we'll kind of dismiss for the night.
I kept wanting to holler at David and saying, so much emphasis on Nick's treatment. Get yourself into treatment, buddy. There was a tremendous amount of enabling by the family which adds the addicted individual from the consequences of their actions. So they're not really experiencing the full experience of what their addiction causes.
Right, absolutely. And I appreciate that you take us there. I think that's a good place to leave it, because one of the biggest challenges right now in research is trying to understand for family members, what's the difference between supporting and enabling? Because we talk about them like they're wildly different concepts, but the line between them is really thin. And actually it changes depending on who your family is, what your family context is. So I actually have a graduate student, her name's Crystal, who is going to be writing her master's thesis on that subject. And we're going to sit down and interview family members and try to understand from the perspective of family members, what do you think is the difference between enabling and supporting? So that'll be interesting and a great place to leave it for tonight. So read part 5 and the epilogue for next Tuesday, and I'll see you at 7:30.